Welcome to the third session of Samson the Nazarite, Soul on Fire with Rabbi David Silber, part of our summer kolo here at Drisha. In this series, we will investigate the celebrated character and tale of Samson from the Book of Judges. We will pay special attention to his status as a Nazarite, exploring its implications and significance. Sources for today are going to come from the Book of Judges, chapters 13, 14, and 15. If you have your own preferred Tanakh, you are very welcome to refer to it. I will be putting sources on screen when Rabbi Silber quotes them. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to him.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are moving ahead with the story of Shimshon. We have today's session and next week's session. We'll start with chapter 14. Shimshon is born. His mother names him Shimshon. And we're told at the very end of chapter 13 that the Spirit of God begins to move him. Ufa'amo, b'machane Dan, bein tzara uvein eshta'ol. So Shimshon is from the tribe of Dan, which is an interesting point. Maybe we'll get back to that possibly next week. I'm not sure, but we only have so much time. In any event, we begin our story. Vayered Shimshon Timnata, Vayarisha b'Timnata mibnot Plishtim. So Shimshon goes to a town of Timnah, and there he sees one of the daughters of the Philistines. He sees a Philistine woman. Going to Timnah is interesting. We have that in the Torah. It's where Judah goes, actually, the story of Judah and Tamar. It's where Judah sets out after his wife dies. He sets out to go to Timnah to shear the sheep. And that's when Tamar hears about this, and she runs down and she stands on the road, and that's where they meet. So it's interesting. There also, he thinks she's a prostitute. And over here, Shimshon goes to Timnah. I'm not sure it's the same Timnah. It's certainly the same word. And he sees one of the Philistine women. Vayomer isha ra'iti b'timnata b'bnot plishtim v'ata kecha otali leisha. So Shimshon goes to his parents, and he says to them, "Listen, I saw this woman she's a Philistine woman. I want you to take her for me as a wife. I want you to arrange the marriage. Apparently, the marriage is arranged between the parents of the bride and groom. So I want you to, I want to marry this woman." Vayomelo aviv v'imo, ha'in bibnot achecha uv'chol ami isha, ki ata holech l'kach isha b'plishtim. So the parents say to him, "Why do you have to marry a Philistine? Isn't there a Jewish woman someplace that we know? Don't go to the Philistines. You're going to l'kach isha b'plishtim ha'arilim from the uncircumcised Philistines." Vayomer Shimshon el aviv ota kachli ki hi yashra b'einai. This is take her for me. Hi yashra b'einai. I just want to return. I mentioned briefly about that phrase. Hi yashra b'einai. The translation is, here we have in front of us from Sefaria, she is the one that pleases me. I'm not sure that actually captures, in my view, what Shimshon is really saying over here. It does mean Yashra b'einai, she's suitable in my eyes. But Yashra b'einai, Yashar b'einav, which is, by the way, an expression that the book will have later. After the Shimshon narrative, there's the epilogue, which talks about in those days there was no king in Israel. Ish hayashar b'einav yaseh. People would do whatever they wanted, which is certainly in that context negative. There's no question. And there are those people who have connected Shimshon to the larger narrative of Israel. The same way Shimshon follows his eyes, and the Mishnah points this out, he does what is Yashar b'einav, which they see as a negative. So too Israel, in the broader picture of Israel, they're also doing what is Yashar b'einav, which is the last two stories of this book. Story of the concubine of Giva, the story of the idol of Micha, anarchy, civil war, idolatry in some sort form or another, and they connect those two. So for those readers, the story of Shimshon is a mirror, as it were, of the broader situation within the Jewish people, generally speaking, in the book of Judges. That was an argument. The primary person who advanced this argument was Professor Ed Greenstein from JTS, and I disagree with it. But certainly what he points out is certainly true. That you have Ish Hayashar B'Einav Yaseh is certainly a negative in the last 5 chapters of the book. The question is, what do we make of it over here? It's the same expression. Do we therefore assume that it has the same significance or not? I don't believe it does. But I want to make a point about this expression, Yashra B'Einai, because it touches on what is a critical issue in the Shimshon story. Critical question. And that is, well, it's a question about Shimshon's behavior, but it's also a question about how much Shimshon actually knows. Now, let me give you another example where we have this expression, Yashar B'Einav, and in contrast to a different word. And that is in the story of King David. King David has defeated Goliath. It's chapter 17 of Shmuel Aleph, David against Goliath. And before the fights against Goliath, he hears people saying that whoever kills Goliath, the king will give him his daughter in marriage. That's what people are saying. And sure enough, after David defeats Goliath, King Saul approaches David, or he has people approach David and say, maybe you want to marry the king's daughter. Now, at that point in this story, in the book of Shmuel, Saul has already decided he wants to kill David. He's suspicious of David. He thinks David wants to replace him, wants to take the kingship away from him. So he wants to kill David. So he has people speak to David, and he says to David, I'll just read it to you. I believe it's chapter 18 of Shmuel. Yes, chapter 18 of Shmuel Aleph. So, verse number 17. Chapter 18 of Shmuel Aleph, verse 17. Vayomer Shaul el David, Hinei briti agdula meirav. Oto atenu lecha leisha, achayegu leben chayu, v'yochem milchamot Hashem. V'Shaul amar, al tiyadibo, utibo yad plishtim. So in other words, Saul wants to get David killed. He says, listen, here's my oldest daughter, her name is Meirav. You can have her as a wife. But in return, be a ben chayo, be a valiant warrior, and fight God's battles. Saul thought. The book tells us what Saul is thinking. He said, why should I kill this guy? Let him die in battle. Let the Philistines kill him. But David refuses. David refuses to marry Meirav. David says, who am I that I should become your majesty's son-in-law? Right? Being very modest. Who am I? I'm unworthy of such an honor, O glorious king. So meanwhile, in all this conversation, Meirav is given to somebody else. She marries somebody else. Fine. Now we have the next verse. That's Meirav is the oldest daughter. Vate'ahav Michal bat Shaul et David. V'yagidu l'Shaul, v'yishar hadavar b'einav. Saul was told something very unusual in the Bible. Michal, his other daughter, loves David. Vayishar hadavar b'einav. The matter was, Saul was pleased. Vayishar b'einav. We have the same expression we have here. Vayishar b'einav. And again, we're told what Saul is thinking in the next verse. Let me give her to him, and she'll be a mokesh, a stumbling block, and let the Philistines kill him. So Saul said to David, "Bishtayim titchatein bihayom." They translate here, you can become my son-in-law through the other one. I'm not getting into the whole story over here and the details of it. In my book, I talk about this, but leave it out for now. And now Saul commands his servants to speak to David and say to David, listen, the king really likes you. That's the next verse. Right? And now in verse 23, and the king likes you, and the king wants you to marry his daughter. And they told David. And David says, who am I to marry the king's daughter? I'm just a poor person. In other words, it sounds like he's saying, I have no money to pay for a big dowry, anything like that, to bring money into the. I'm a poor guy. But the servants say to David, the king doesn't want money. 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Kill me 100 Philistines. And Saul was thinking, the Philistines will kill David. Now let's keep reading more. What happens next? Next verse. Yes, scroll down. Next verse. Right. Vayagidu. Now they tell David what Saul is saying. Forget the money. Kill me 100 Philistines. Vayishar hadavar b'yeinei David. We have the same expression. Vayishar hadavar b'yeinav. The matter was suitable, was pleasing in David's eyes to marry into the king's family. And the time was not up. He still has time to do it. So David goes in the next verse and he kills 200 Philistines. That's the text we have. Right. And Saul gives Michal, his daughter, to David as a wife. Now, why do I cite all this over here? Because it's clear that whoever writing the story right. It's clear there are parallels between the story over here and our story in chapter 14 of Shimshon. What's interesting is in the story of David, in David's marriage to Saul's daughter, he ends up marrying the younger daughter. There's the younger daughter. Merav is the older daughter. That doesn't work out. David refuses to marry Merav, but then Michal, Saul is told, loves David. V'tahav Michal et David, and Saul tries with the second one. And the second time, David agrees. Vayishar b'yeinav. Now, why does David agree the second time and not agree the first time? What's the difference between the second time and the first time? You know what the difference is? The first time, he says, listen, you can marry my daughter Merav, but be a ben chayil. Be a valiant warrior. And Saul's thinking to kill David. And David says to himself, be a valiant warrior. Go into the elite commando units, you know what I mean? The most dangerous operations. And David says to himself, at some point in time, it's quite probable I'm not going to survive. I may survive the first time. I may survive the first 20 times. But at some point, if my job is to be a soldier who's a ben chayil, there's not a good percentage in that. So David refuses on the pretext, I'm not worthy, whatever. But the second one is different. The second one is a specific amount. Kill me 100 Philistines. That David can do. In fact, he kills 200. That he can do. And that we are told, Vayishar b'yeinav. And here's my point. In the story of Saul and David, in the marriage of David to Saul's daughter, the book of Shmuel uses the expression Vayishar b'yeinei, both for Saul and for David. Vayishar b'yeinei Shaul, when he has the idea that Michal is going to marry David, we're told 3 times by the writer that Saul thinks, this way I'll get him killed. Saul's goal in marrying his daughter to David is sooner rather than later to transform his daughter into a very young widow. That's what Saul wants to do. He's going to marry his daughter to this guy that he wants to kill. What about David? What is David thinking over here? What's David's calculation? I use the calculation on purpose. He has one calculation. It's exactly what he claims he's unworthy to do. He wants to be the son-in-law of the king because that's a stepping stone to the kingship. He's already been anointed king privately, by the way, in the book of Shmuel. So it's all about two calculating people, one being nastier than the other, but each one has a calculation. And in contrast to Yashar b'yeinav, we have a different term, which is ahava. There is love here. But the love is not directed from either of the men towards this woman. The love is directed from the woman towards her prospective husband. In fact, it's a very strange expression we very infrequently find where it says the woman loves the man. The contrast between the two. I mean, this is the book of Shmuel, the contrast between the calculating men, each one thinking about their position, and this poor woman, basically, who actually is in love. And this is when we first meet Michal and Meirav, especially Michal, and it's a sad story from this point on, because it's all about the calculation. Now, I mentioned that, coming back to our chapter of Shimshon, because that's exactly the point. He Ashra bi einai should not be, I would translate that she pleases me. That's the JPS translation. I would say she suits my purposes. He has one purpose. Shimshon has a mission. Speaking about a Ben Chayil, by the way, that's his mission. His mission is to kill the Philistines. That's what his boss wants. Who is his boss? His boss is God. He's God's child, actually. And that's it. And that's his mission. That's why he's created. It's God's child. He's created to fight God's enemies. God's enemies are the Philistines. And it's clear here, but it's even more clear later. The Philistines are God's enemy. I mean, they're also Israel's enemy, but they're God's enemy. And they have a particular way of operating, which is to belittle and to mock whomever they are fighting. I make this point over here because, first of all, the expression Yashra b'einai, Shimshon's calculations, which in my view, the text justifies, because that's his mission. He gets in trouble. He gets in trouble when he falls in love. Now, he doesn't love the woman of Timnah. He just uses her. But later, in the narrative, he falls in love. Acharei chen, the last chapter, Vayehav isha b'nachal soreg ushma Delilah. He loves a woman from Nachal Soreg. Her name is Delilah. And that's when he gets into trouble. And that, in a way, is the tragedy of Shimshon, that he cannot. When you say the Nazir is someone who's alone, he's alone in a deep sense because he doesn't live amongst his own people. In fact, his own people try to hand him over later on. They tie him up and want to hand him over. But he also can't be part of the Philistines. He lives among the Philistines. He's sleeping around with the Philistine women. But there's no relationship there until he meets Delilah. And that's when he gets into trouble. Now, I want to make another point before there's several interesting points over here about this. But I want to make just the following observation. When you think about it, it's actually obvious. But I'm going to point it out anyway. And that is, when you look at the Shimshon story, there are 4 chapters. 13, 14, 15, and 16. When you look at the 4 chapters of Shimshon, you read, of course, you start by reading the 4 chapters. That's how we start. We learn by reading the 4 chapters. And you see immediately that the 4 chapters divide into 2 groups, 2 parallel groups. The first group is chapter 13 and 14 and 15. That's the first group. In fact, the end of chapter 15, we have the verse, Vayishpot et Yisrael b'mei plishtim esrim shana. Shimshon doesn't mean he's judging, but he's leading the people for 20 years. That's the last verse of chapter 15. Then you get to chapter 16 when he meets Delilah, and there you have the last verse of chapter 16 is that they bury him together with his father. V'ushafat et Yisrael esrim shana. He judged Israel for 20 years. He led Israel. You have exactly the same verse at the end of chapter 15 that you have at the end of chapter 16. It's very striking. And not just that, because you have the same ending to both of those chapters, you suddenly realize that the 2 chapters have many, many parallels. I'll mention one of them in a couple of minutes, one of the obvious ones. But there are there's a parallel between what happens with Delilah in chapter 16, that we'll get to next week, and what happens with Shimshon's first wife, the woman of Timnah, in chapter 14. And we'll get to that in a moment. There's plenty to do still. And we'll notice, when you notice one parallel, you usually notice 10 parallels. That's the way it works. So the two stories are parallel stories, but I wanted to make that point about the difference between Yashar B'Einai on one hand and loving on the other, which in the book of Shmuel, the book takes that idea, and that's a very central book, that central idea in the book of Shmuel. Because one of the ideas of the book of Shmuel, in my book on Shmuel, which I picked up on, was that the king actually, kingship comes at a price. And one of the prices of kingship is, I'm not saying it has to be this way, but certainly in the David narrative, in the plain reading of David, it is this way. That you have that picture of David at the end of his life, which is the first verse of the book of Malachim, which is just an extension of Shmuel, first two chapters. King David was old. They covered him with clothing, right? Maybe with blankets. He could not be warmed. You have that picture of David. At the end of the day, with all the successes and the triumphs and this wife and that wife, this guy is lying down and he's cold. And there's nobody around. He's cold, and there's nobody with him. His own son is declaring himself king. His prophet and one of his wives are plotting how they can get Solomon to be the king. That's the price of kingship. The price of kingship is you basically die alone. And that's part of the story. So, because you're always calculating. David is calculating all the time. Calculates. And someone who calculates all the time can never have a real relationship. Not possible. Because you can never be vulnerable. You're a calculator. So, but the story of Shimshon is, I would say, in the case of David, we have less, actually much less, I would say we have less sympathy. I'll speak for myself. Less sympathy with David's character. And there's a tragic side to David's character. But with Shimshon, we can be very sympathetic because he is born to be the Nazir. He's chosen for that purpose. He's not making a choice. He's born a Nazir. He's not born a Jew, as I said. He's born a Nazir. He's the ultimate outsider. And living your whole life as the outsider, that's not a simple matter. So the first woman, the woman of Timnah, he's just going to use her. And let's just take a look briefly at that story, because we have so little time here. But let's continue the story. Fine. Vayavo, fine. So he right. Let's take verse number 4, chapter 14, verse 4. Very important verse. Very important. V'aviv imo lo yadu ki me Hashemi ki to'anahu mevakesh mi plishtim uvreitahi plishtim moshelim b'Yisrael. His parents did not know that this came from God. Ki to'anahu, to'anah. How do we translate the word to'anah? Here they translate pretext. I think that's a good translation. Now, the question is, to'anah, who was seeking for a pretext? Was it God? He said the matter came from God. Ki to'anahu mevakesh. For he was seeking a pretext. But who is the he? Does it mean God is seeking a pretext? This is coming from God. This whole thing, God is telling him to do this, or God is moving him in this direction. God is setting up the circumstance. Because God wants to use Shimshon to get at the Philistines. Or does it mean they didn't know, his parents didn't understand that when Shimshon says, I want to marry the Philistine woman, and that's part of his idea. He is seeking a pretext. He's going to live amongst the Philistines and fight the Philistines as a kind of Philistine, or from within the Philistine community. This is one of the big questions about Shimshon. To what degree does Shimshon understand his role? And to what degree is no? He's just a guy. He's a guy who's whatever. He lives on impulse. He does whatever is in his eyes. I think the Mishnah tends more towards that reading. But personally, I think when you read it, I have a different sense. I think he's actually consciously looking for a pretext. Parents don't understand this. To'anahu vakesh. He's seeking a pretext. Uvaitahi Plishtim Moshlim b'Yisrael. So it could be God, it could be the Shimshon. So this is the question: is Shimshon aware or not aware? Personally, I think he is aware. I think he's seeking a pretext. Fine. Now we have the following story, famous story. Vayavo ad Karmei Timnata. They came to the vineyards of Timnah. V'nei kfir arayot shoeg l'kvato. And behold, a full-grown lion came roaring at him. Now, one interpretation, which I think makes a lot of sense, is because his parents are not with him at this point. And one of the commentaries, maybe it's in the Gemara, because they came to a vineyard, and Shimshon is a nazir. Shimshon can't eat any grape products. So at that point, he went on one path, maybe to avoid the vineyards. But the parents, they walked through the vineyard. He took a roundabout route because he doesn't want to go to the vineyard. So he's walking by himself. He encounters a young lion, a young lion. What happens? The Spirit of God descends upon him. With his bare hands, he tore the lion apart, as one might tear a kid. But there was nothing in his hands. With his own hands, his own strength, he actually tears the lion apart. And he doesn't tell his parents. They have no idea. He doesn't tell his parents. He keeps them totally in the dark. Again, Batishar b'yanei Shimshon. She suits his purposes. So apparently they had the custom that we have, that the Talmud speaks of, where there was like an engagement, or even more than engagement. They're going to get married. Fine, set aside for marriage, but they don't get married right away. They have to prepare for the marriage. So he goes away. He returns later on, at some point later. He's going to take her as a wife. He goes back, he passes the same route. He sees the lion's skeleton, but he sees inside the skeleton, there's a swarm of bees, like a hive, inside the lion, and dvash, honey. Passes by this incredible scene. And inside this lion, there's dvash, there's the bees. So he takes some of the honey for himself. And he's eating the honey. He gives them the honey to eat. But he doesn't tell them where he got it from. He gives them the honey, but he doesn't tell them where he got it from. Fine. Now we have the following story. So Shimshon's meeting his wife is like a sheva brachas. It's a wedding party. This is a standard wedding party. They invite 30 guests to the party. The Shimshon is there with his new wife, the woman of Timnah, and the Philistines invite 30 guests. Says Shimshon, I want to tell you a riddle. Chida is a riddle. Lachud chida. Sometimes in biblical Hebrew, the verb takes the form of the noun. Chida is the riddle. Lachud chida. I want to riddle you a riddle. And Shimshon says, Imagei tagidu otali, shivat yimei hamishter, u'mitzatem, v'natati lochem shloshim sudinim, u'shloshim charifot bigodim. He says, you know what, if you could figure out my riddle, by the end of the 7 days, it's a 7-day wedding party, at the end of the 7 days, I will give you 30 tunics and 30 sets of clothing. But if you can't figure it out, if you can't, then each one of you, natatem li, shloshim sadinim ushloshim chalifot begadim. Vayomru lo chuda chidratcha v'nishma'ena. And they say to him, okay, tell us your riddle. Tell us your riddle. And Shimshon says to them in the 14th pasuk, Vayomer me'ochel yotza ma'achal u'me'az yotza matok. Here's my riddle. 6 words. From the one who eats, me'ochel yotza ma'achal. The ochel became food. U'me'az, and from the powerful one, sweetness emerged. That's the riddle. Now, I will say that unless you actually know the story, I think it would be pretty impossible to be able to decipher the riddle. He's referring obviously to his story of the lion that he bit with his own hands. He kills the lion. Upon return, he finds within the lion a beehive, all kinds of honey, which he takes for himself, he gives to his parents, etc. This is the point of the riddle. Now, I want to stop here for a minute before we get to the solution, which they can't figure it out. They figure it out by pressuring his new wife, to wheedle the solution out of Shimshon and to tell them. And they threaten her if she doesn't do it, they're going to burn her down with her father. Okay, leave that out for now. Obviously, the riddle is very central over here. If we read this chapter, Shimshon is one who has a riddle, and the specific story is obviously critical to the larger Shimshon narrative. And what is the story actually about? So first of all, I want to say 2 things here. First of all, and I'll stop and take any comments and questions. First of all, the idea of a riddle. Actually, the word riddle is a very interesting word, because the word riddle, I would say, has a sort of negative side to it. I would say it's hostile. They found the person who was shot. The person was riddled with bullets, you say, right? Riddled, to be riddled, carries with it often a very negative, sort of hostile, negative feel to it. So Shimshon is a riddler, and I would say one of the reasons that riddles have a negative side to them, or potentially negative side to them, is what the riddle is actually about. When I say to you, let me tell you something. I know something you don't know. That's what it comes down to. I know something you don't know, right? I know something you don't know, that kind of thing. There's a hostile side to it. And in this regard, I would say that, and people who hear that typically don't take kindly to it. I would say the obvious parallel to Shimshon, the Nazarite, the Riddler, is the one that the Torah calls the Nazir, which of course is Joseph. It's called the Nazir both by Jacob, Nazir Echav. It's called the tribe of Yosef is Nazir Echav as well. And what actually irritates the brothers, primarily when they see Joseph coming towards them to make peace, actually, they don't know that. The dreamer is coming towards us. And the point of the dreamer is what bothers them about Joseph is, what Joseph is saying in effect is, I have secret knowledge that you don't have. I was told something in secret. Now, Joseph tells them what it is in secret, which doesn't endear him to his brothers either. But the idea of Joseph the dreamer and Shimshon the riddler, there's a connection, and especially since Joseph has the ability not just to experience dreams, he also is the one who is interpreting dreams. And Shimshon, as we'll see, is both the dreamer, or both the riddler in this case. I have secret knowledge, but he also is, I believe, or tries to be the interpreter of dreams. So you have over here, that's point number 1. But there's something else about this particular story. And that is what, because obviously the story of Shimshon, this is obviously a critical story. He's coming with his parents, doesn't tell them anything. He encounters this lion when he's by himself. He kills the lion. Then he comes back to the same place. And he finds within the lion a hive, the honey, sweetest thing in the world. He takes it for himself, and he gives his parents honey. And it strikes me that the point of the particular incident is that what the incident really is about Shimshon himself. That is actually that is the perfect description of Shimshon. So on one hand, he's the lion. He is this all-powerful creature who can destroy anything in his way. But at the same time, he has potentially the honey inside him, because his real mission is, first of all, he works for God. It's God's honor. But at the end of the day, willy-nilly, he is a redeemer of Israel. Both sections of the Shimshon narrative, the first one ends in chapter 15, the second in chapter 16, Hu shafat es Yisrael esrim shana. Now, chapter 13 made it clear, and that is, he's not going to bring about the full redemption. The Philistines still control. When the angel came to Mrs. Manoach and told her what Shimshon's son's going to do, the angel was clear. Hu yachel et Yisrael, Hoshea et Yisrael. He will begin to redeem Israel from the Philistines. He doesn't complete the job, but he does begin to redeem Israel, even though Israel is not necessarily interested. But he still brings about some redemption to Israel. He kills the lion, he takes the honey for himself, but he also gives it to his parents. His parents don't understand anything. The parents are out of the loop. Parents don't understand. The angel in the previous story made it clear that Manoach himself, the man, is never told what Shimshon is going to do, even though he asked. Mishpat hanaru ma'aseyu. And the angel says to Manoach, yeah, just do whatever I told your wife to do. The angel never says to Manoach, Shimshon is a redeemer. The woman hears it, but he never hears it. He never hears the story. So the point is that I think that the story over here of the Devash and the lion is a perfect representation of this of the character of Shimshon. On one hand, he's the lion. On the other hand, there is within him something very sweet. That is to say, there's something very positive within him. So this is perhaps what we're so taken with this incident, because I don't want to psychologize him, but we the readers see clearly that the person of Shimshon and this lion with the honey inside, that the two of them seem to be very much connected. He understands the mission. I think there's evidence later that we'll get to maybe next week to demonstrate he actually understands the mission. Understanding the mission, though, and living with the mission are two very different things. Let me just make one last point, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions, then we'll continue. And that is, I said before that when you look at the Shimshon story, and you divide it into two pieces, one through chapter 15, and one is chapter 16. So let me make one comment about the parallels. Each of those two stories, there is a woman. There's a woman at the center of the story. In the first case, it's the woman from Timnah, his wife from Timnah, and we'll see. The story with her continues. But the wife of Timnah, his new wife, and he marries in chapter 14. The people at the wedding party, they can't figure out the answer to Shimshon's riddle, so they go to the wife, the newlywed, right? It's the wedding party during Shabbat brachas, and they say, "Listen, you better tell us the answer you better give us the answer, right?" The verse number 15, for example, Vayom Hashvi, Vayomru le'eshet Shimshon, Pati et ishech, seduce your husband, Yaged lanu et achida, Penisrof otach yet beito vicha ba'esh, lest we burn you in your father's house. We'll burn you down. By the way, these are not the kind of people you necessarily want to invite to your wedding. These are the 30 friends they've got, right? It's the 30 friends. Listen, honey, you better seduce this guy, or else we're going to kill you and your father. We're going to burn you out, burn you down. What did you bring us here to make us poor, to impoverish us? Not that they're going to be poor, by the way, because each one only has to give one coat. So you're not going to be so poor. You lose a coat. Shimshon would lose 30 coats. It's a one-sided. He risks losing 30. Each of them only loses one. It doesn't matter. So what does she do? She nudges him. She tries to seduce him and nudge him. She says to him in the next pasuk, "Vatev geshet Shimshon olav vatomer rak snei tani v'lo avtani." You hate me. You don't love me. Lady, we've been married for 3 days or 7 days. You know what I mean? Okay. You hate me. You don't love me. Hachidoch chalata l'vnei ami v'ligo igalata. You tell them a riddle, but you don't tell me the solution. Terrible. Shimshon says, Idris says, listen, he says, I didn't even tell my own parents. You see, where the sympathies lie more. I didn't tell my own parents. I should tell you. But she keeps crying for 7 days, leaving the number of days out. There's a big problem with the number of days. She cries, she nudges, she this, she that. On the 7th day, vayagedwa, ki hetzikatu, she was tormenting him. So on the 7th day, on the last day, he tells her the solution, and right away, vataged hachida livnei amah, she tells her own people the solution to the riddle. That's the woman of Timnah. That's the newlywed of Timnah in chapter 14. Now, what about the other one, Delilah, in chapter 16? Right in chapter 16, we have Delilah, and chapter 16, verse number 4. There uses the word love. He falls in love with Delilah from Nachal Sorek, and the Philistines go to Delilah, the wife. The heads of the Philistines. The Philistines don't have kings here in this book. They have Sranim, they have like officers, chief officers. Seduce him. Let us know where is this great strength coming from, and how we can overcome him, how we can defeat him. And tie him up and torture him. This is the woman that he loves. We each will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Now, she then proceeds to do precisely that. And he doesn't tell her the riddle right away. It takes her 4 different times to find out the truth. At the end of the day, he tells her the truth. We'll talk about that next time. But my point is, when you look at the 2 stories, even the language is the same. He finally gives her the answer. He finally tells Delilah the truth, because he can't take it anymore. She's making his life miserable. And it uses even the same word in chapter 16. She's pressuring him. She's nagging him. But to the degree that he'd rather die. He can't take it anymore. She constantly is nudging him. And like the story of the woman of Timnah, he tells her the truth. So you have 2 parallel stories over here. You have the story of the woman of Timnah, and you have the parallel story of Delilah. They're virtually identical stories. He has some knowledge that no one else has. And in the first instance, Shimshon sets up this bet, and they want to solve the riddle. Otherwise, they're going to lose. Each one will lose a coat. 2 take a coat. In the second instance, it's not that. It's that she's offered a bribe. We'll give you a lot of money if you can just let us know where his strength comes from, so that we can tie him up and we can torture him. And she tries every which way to succeed, and at the end she succeeds. The reason I want to make just one last point about these 2 stories, the 2 women are different. This we see. The first one, it's clear. Rabbi and I. We'll see more about this next week as well, but this one suits my purposes. He never says he loves the first one. He's using her. I mean, it's a nasty business, actually. But that's what the world of espionage is all about, that, right? What is that's how you get information. blackmail, it's whatever it is. That's you find people that are vulnerable, or people that will betray their own people. That's how you get information. But the second story is that of love. And here's the point. So these are the two women of Samson, but there's another woman. There's a woman who appears in the beginning of chapter 16, and that is this prostitute of Azza. Beginning of chapter 16. This woman is the Zona. He's not in love with her. She's a Zona. And the Gazites, the Azadim, hear that Shimshon is there, and they wait in ambush. They said, let's wait till the morning, and when the morning comes, we'll attack him and we'll be able to kill him. But Shimshon gets up in the middle of the night. He gets up and he grabs the doors of the town gate. He pulls them along with the bar. He places them on his shoulders and carries them away to a hill which is near Hebron. And the question is, what is that story doing here? In other words, we understand the story of the woman of Timnah. That's how Shimshon is going to, we'll get to it next time, but Shimshon uses that whole story. He's very angry about the fact that they pressured his newlywed wife. He goes out and he kills 30 Philistines and gives these 30 people at the party the coats of 30 Philistines from Ashkelon. It's a pretext to fight the Philistines. That we understand. We understand the significance of Delilah because that's Samson's downfall. It's when Samson loses his power. But for the life of us, what is the function of this story? Of the Zona from Azza? How does she function in this story? So I want to make a suggestion about the Zona of Azza. And that is that, and why the Shimshon story with the power of the story, which is that you have a person whose job it is to fight the Philistines, but is set up in such a way that he actually has no connection to anybody. His own people, he simply leaves. He leaves his own people. He never dwells amongst his own people. He lives only among the Philistines. And he has a relationship with the Jewish people, let's say his parents. On one hand, when he finds the honey, he gives it to his parents. He actually loves his parents. He said to his newlywed wife, if I didn't tell my own parents, I'm going to tell you. But the point is, his mission is to leave them. And he doesn't live amongst the Jews. And the Jews are going to tie him up and try to hand him over. But that's his mission. But the problem is, can you actually live with that? Can you live this kind of solitary life where there's no human interaction? And it's very difficult. And I think that the tragedy of Shimshon is that exactly that he wants to fall in love. Because otherwise you live in this world alone. It's just making all world of calculations. So the first wife is clear. Rabbi, he's just using her as a way to fight the Philistines. Delilah he actually loves. And in between those two stories, the turning point is the Zona. The Zona he uses for himself. He's not calculating her. He's not getting involved with her with some greater purpose. There's no greater purpose. The Zona is companionship of sorts for a brief time. And that is actually, I think that story of the Zona is there as a kind of fulcrum. It's a story that's in between the one he simply uses and the one that he loves. And I said the deeper tragedy here, or the tragedy, I would say he's not set up to fail, but he's put in a situation in which he, it's a difficult way to function. He's torn between, on one hand, wanting to be human, on one hand, and the mission which he's been given before he's born. It's not the Nazarite who chooses to be a Nazarite. It's the Nazarite whom God chooses that he should be a Nazarite. So let me stop here for a moment, and there's a lot more here, and we'll continue with this next time. But let me first stop and take any comments or questions.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting what you said about the riddle, and And I wanted to add something, um, because when I was first learning the story, I was like reading I think it was Yigal Ariel who said that actually that like the lion symbolized the Philistines. And so then he like but then I heard somebody else say actually it symbolized Shimshon. It's like very interesting to see how people kind of interpret it, and how the lion can be all these things at once. But what I kind of found what I kind of settled on, what I found interesting about it is that like it's not just like there's honey inside the lion, but he has to tear the lion apart to get to the honey. Like the lion is no longer a real lion, the lion's a dead lion. He's not really like the point is he brings about the salvation of the Israelites, but like he has to destroy himself to get there.
That's an interesting thought. That so is what happens. And at the end of the day, he's, as he says, Tamon Nafshim Plishtim. The reason I like the Shimshon is because of the honey inside it. I think that it is exactly the story of Shimshon. I think there's someone who kind of, you see him from an external standpoint, he's this incredibly, he has this supernatural power. But he's also very, very human. I think that's my point. There's a contrast between his, at the end of the day, he's a person. And he has the needs, the desires, and the hopes of any person, even though he has the supernatural strength. So I think it is it's a very human story in a way. And we'll get to next time. I want to point out that of all the prophets, and of all the not prophets, of all the chieftains of Israel, from a certain sense, from a religious sense, he's by far the most religious. I mean, Devorah is also religious, but but we have with Shimshon what we don't have with the others, which is prayer. Shimshon prays twice, and there's a real sense of being very close to God, which makes total sense given the fact that he's God's child, actually. And so I think that there is this sense on one hand of this incredible power this guy has. On the other hand, he's very, very human. I mean, prayer is a sign of one's humanity, because what prayer is about at the end of the day is a recognition, among other things, of our own limitations. It's not just that. It's also about our own commitments, but it's only about our limitations. And you have this supernatural person who, in two different stories, we'll see this next time, comes face to face with his own weakness, his own mortality, and he turns to God in those situations. He prays to God, and God responds each time. So there's something about that. But I coming back to the same point about secret knowledge, which is essential to the story. We'll come back to this next week with Delilah. Why does Shimshon lose his strength? I want to talk about that next week. Yes, his hair is cut, but is that really the reason he loses his strength? I don't think so. But we'll get to that next time. Anybody else have a comment or question?
Yes.
Yes.
There's, if you have the time, there's two questions in chat.
Yeah,
First is from Yehudi Bursky. Quote, as a Nazir, was he not supposed to eat the honey from the lion because of Tuma?
That's a very good question. I didn't think so. I didn't see that as a problem. I'll tell you, there is interesting halachic question. There is a halacha. Not that this text deals with halacha at all, but I would say there's no problem eating the honey. There is a halacha, actually, interesting halacha, which appears in the Gemara in a couple of places. Hayotze minat tameh is tameh. That is true. If you have a non-kosher animal, let's say a non-kosher fowl, then you can't eat the fowl, and you can't eat the eggs of the fowl either. Whatever comes from a non-kosher animal is not kosher. So that is true. But I would say the honey doesn't actually come from the lion. The lion was already dead. The bees use the lion's carcass as a place to build their hive and to produce the. So there is no prohibition of eating honey in any event, even by any standards. But in the Nazir, in the Chumash, can't have grape products. There's no other prohibition. What's the other question?
This is from Stacy Lehman asking,
Yep.
Is there some parallel or relationship to Moshe, who also doesn't live among his people?
I would say the following. Every leader, everyone, to some degree, doesn't live amongst his people. In the sense, and in the following sense. I mean, you live amongst your people, that's true. But every leader has to forego some kind of personal link. But your job is to work for the people. Moshe Rabbeinu is the ultimate leader. I mean, he leads us, he teaches us, he prays for us. But he's also very separate from the people. So certainly the prophet is certainly separate. Think about the great prophets of our tradition, apart from Moshe, Eliyahu Hanavi, the ultimate outsider. The prophet's job is prophet has one job, which makes him rather unpopular typically, which is to tell the truth. That's the prophet's job. He's got to tell the truth. So I would say every leader to some degree has to leave his family, has to leave it, because you represent the people. You do what's best for the people, not any particular. So I think every leader to some extent, every king. The question is degree. Do you have to actually lose all kind of personal connections, or is it possible to maintain some kind of personal link and still be a king, for example? I think that's one of the questions when you study the book of Shmuel, which is about kingship, and David being the primary king. You know, the story that the book tells is about someone who is, from a personal standpoint, this is the David of Samuel. There are other Davids in that tradition. But from a personal standpoint, is very compromised. He has no real relationships, actually. When I say none, I say zero. No real relationships. He has people that helped him out, but in terms of relationships, no. Jonathan, no. Jonathan helps David. David does nothing for Jonathan except to give a eulogy. So the point is, I think it's true in general. I think it's a question of degree. But the case of Shimshon is extreme. The Shimshon is, of course, from his birth, it's that way. It's not that he made choices later in life or whatever. From his very birth, he is, in fact, and he doesn't dwell amongst his people either. Moshe lives amongst the Jews. Moshe is our teacher. Moshe travels with us. But in the Shimshon story, until his death and burial, he's buried in his father's grave. There's no sense whatsoever that he's living amongst the Jews. It says that early on. He goes to Timnah, sees a Philistine woman there, and the rest of the story is about Samson in the midst of the Philistines. So I'd say it's one of the features of the Shimshon story that make it very different. We have no character like Shimshon. So okay, there's a lot more to say over here. And we still have one more session, so I hope next time we can address some of these themes and to try to get a more complete picture of Shimshon as represented here in these 4 chapters, which Shimshon is the last prophet, the last chieftain in the book of Judges. It's true that Shmuel is called the Shofet, Ewi is called the Shofet, but they're different. Ewi is Ewi, the priest, and Shmuel is Shmuel, the prophet. They lead the people, the priest and the prophet. But in terms of the Shoftim that we encounter in the book of Shoftim, Shimshon is the last one. Maybe we'll talk about that as well next time. I have to stop at this point. So we'll continue next time. Hopefully we'll finish it up and address some of these issues that have been raised and see where we take it. Looking forward. Okay. Thank you all.
Take care, everyone, and see you all next week for the final class in this session.